I need to tell you something that I've carried in my heart for nearly 40 years. If you're watching this from your living room, your kitchen table, or wherever you find yourself tonight, please know that what I'm about to share isn't easy for me. But at 67 years old, I've learned that some truths need to be spoken, even when they hurt. My name is David Morrison, and I'm speaking to you from my small apartment in Portland, Oregon. The walls around me are lined with books now, history, philosophy, poetry, things I wasn't allowed to read for many years of my life. There's a particular scent in the air tonight, that mixture of old paper and the lavender candle my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, brings me every Christmas. It reminds me of freedom, though it took me decades to understand what that word truly meant. If this is your first time here, I want to thank you for stopping by. And if you've been following my stories, welcome back. Please, if this touches your heart in any way, leave me a comment below. I read every single one, and knowing that my words reach people across this country, from small towns in Montana to busy cities like New York, gives this old man strength to keep sharing these difficult memories. When I was 22 years old, I received what I believed was the greatest honor of my life, an invitation to serve at the world headquarters of what I then considered God's only true organization. I had been one of Jehovah's Witnesses since childhood, baptized at 16, pioneering since 18. My parents, Harold and Ruth Morrison, cried tears of joy when that letter arrived at our modest home in Cleveland, Ohio. "David's going to Bethel," my mother whispered to our neighbor over the backyard fence, her voice carrying that mixture of pride and awe reserved for the most sacred announcements. "Our boy is going to serve at the very center of God's earthly organization." I remember the morning I left Cleveland. It was September 15th, 1978. The leaves were just beginning to turn golden, and there was that crisp smell in the air that promised winter was coming. My father drove me to the Greyhound station in his old blue Chevrolet, the one that always smelled like the aftershave he wore to the Kingdom Hall every Sunday and Thursday. "Son," he said as we sat in the parking lot watching other travelers hurry past with their suitcases, "you're about to enter the most spiritual place on earth. Remember that every day you're there, you're serving Jehovah himself." I carried one brown suitcase and a heart full of absolute certainty. I believed I was chosen. I believed I was special. I believed that behind those imposing gates in Brooklyn, New York, I would find the purest expression of divine love this side of paradise. The bus ride took 14 hours, but I barely slept. I kept reading and rereading the orientation packet they'd sent me, memorizing the schedule, the rules, the expectations. When we finally pulled into the Port Authority terminal, my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from excitement. I was about to step into what I'd been taught was the closest thing to heaven on earth. But sometimes, my friends, what we think is heaven can become our most beautiful prison. And sometimes, the people we trust most with our souls are the ones who understand least about the God they claim to represent. That first taxi ride through Brooklyn, seeing the familiar blue signs pointing toward the Watchtower headquarters, I pressed my face against the window like a child approaching Disney World. The buildings grew larger as we got closer, more imposing, more majestic. When we finally stopped in front of those famous gates, I felt like Moses approaching the burning bush. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that I was about to learn the difference between faith and control, between devotion and manipulation, between serving God and serving an organization that claimed to speak for him. The security guard, who checked my identification, had kind eyes, but spoke in measured, careful words. "Welcome to Bethel, Brother Morrison. You're now part of the worldwide work." As those gates closed behind me, I heard the sound of metal clicking into place. At the time, it sounded like the doors of paradise opening. Only later would I recognize it as the sound of a cage being locked, The first thing they did was assign me a roommate, Brother Timothy Walsh from Minnesota, a thin young man with nervous habits who had been at Bethel for 6 months already. Our room was on the 4th floor of the 124 Columbia Heights building, barely large enough for 2 single beds, 2 small dressers, and a shared desk by the window that looked out onto the promenade. "The walls are thin," Timothy whispered on my first night, his voice barely audible. "Brother Hendricks next door reports everything to the home servant. Last month, Brother Paul got counseled because someone heard him crying during personal prayer time. They said it showed lack of faith in Jehovah's provisions. I should have paid attention to the fear in Timothy's eyes, but I was still floating on the cloud of spiritual privilege. Every morning at 6 a.m. sharp, a bell would ring through the corridors. We had 15 minutes to dress, make our beds with military precision, and report to the dining room for morning worship. The dining room could seat 300 people, and the silence was always absolute, except for the assigned reader at the podium. Brother Marcus Reed, the home servant who oversaw our floor, was a man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had served at Bethel for 23 years, and everyone spoke of him with a mixture of respect and something I couldn't quite identify then, something that felt like fear dressed up as reverence. "Brother Morrison," he said during my orientation meeting, his office decorated with framed photographs of Watchtower conventions and a large picture of the governing body. "You've been brought here because we see spiritual potential in you, but potential must be refined through discipline. Here at Bethel, we don't just work for Jehovah, we become living examples of his organization." My work assignment was in the shipping department, where we prepared literature to be sent to congregations worldwide. The work started at 8 a.m. and ended at 5 p.m., with a 1-hour lunch break and 2 15-minute coffee breaks that were timed down to the minute. Brother Joseph Martinez, the department overseer, was a compact man from Puerto Rico who had been at Bethel for 12 years. He spoke with authority about maintaining the theocratic pace and demonstrating organizational loyalty in every task. "Each piece of literature that leaves this building," Brother Martinez would say during our weekly department meetings, "carries the truth to someone who desperately needs it. When you pack these magazines, you're participating in the most important work happening on earth today." The other workers in my department were an interesting mix. There was Brother Alan Roberts from Texas, 24 years old, who had given up a scholarship to engineering school to serve at Bethel. He had calloused hands and would often stare out the windows during breaks, watching the traffic on the Brooklyn Heights promenade with an expression I couldn't read. Sister Margaret Foster supervised the female workers who helped with packaging. She was perhaps 45, had never married, dedicating her life to the organization, and spoke in the measured tones that all long-term Bethel residents seemed to develop. Her desk was always perfectly organized, and she kept a small calendar where she marked off each day with a red pen. "Time is precious here," she told me during my first week. "Every moment must be accounted for. Personal time is for personal study and meditation on organizational publications. Social conversations should always be upbuilding and focus on spiritual things. The evenings were structured just as rigidly as the days. After dinner, we had 1 hour of personal study time, followed by the Bethel Family Watchtower study on Mondays, the book study on Tuesdays, the Theocratic Ministry School on Thursdays, and the service meeting on Fridays. Saturdays were for field service in the local Brooklyn congregations, and Sundays meant the district convention or circuit assemblies. But it was the small things that should have warned me. The way conversations would stop when certain people walked into a room. The way Brother Timothy would flinch whenever footsteps passed our door after lights out at 10 p.m. The way Brother Allen would sometimes sit on his bed and just stare at the wall, not speaking for hours. "Brother Morrison," Timothy confided to me during our second week as roommates, "do you ever feel like you're being watched? we were folding our laundry, even that had specific procedures about how clothes should be arranged in our dressers. Sometimes I think they read our mail before we get it. And Brother Phillips down the hall, he got called into Brother Reed's office last week because someone reported that he was reading a novel during his personal study time. I remember laughing at his concerns. Timothy, this is Jehovah's house. Everything here is done out of love and concern for our spiritual welfare. If the brothers are watching over us, it's because they care about our spiritual progress. How naive I was. How completely I had absorbed the language that transforms surveillance into love, control into care, isolation into protection. There was a particular smell that permeated the Bethel buildings, a mixture of industrial cleaning products, the offset ink from the printing presses, and something else I could never quite identify. Years later, I would realize it was the smell of fear. Fear disguised as holiness, packaged as devotion, presented as the very essence of spiritual. Their letters full of questions about the spiritual paradise I was experiencing. Tell us about the governing body members, my mother would write. Are they as holy in person as they seem in the publications? Are you learning so much about Jehovah's ways? I would write back with enthusiasm about the privilege of serving, about the wonderful spiritual routine, about how grateful I was to be there. But I never mentioned the growing knot in my stomach during morning worship, or the way my hands would shake when Brother Reed would scan the dining room with those calculating eyes, or how the laughter in the recreation room always seemed forced and performance-ready. The first crack in my certainty came during my 3rd week, when Brother Phillips, the one Timothy had mentioned, simply disappeared. One morning his bed was empty, his belongings gone, and when I asked Brother Reed about him, the response was delivered with that smile that never reached his eyes. Brother Phillips decided that Bethel service wasn't for him. Sometimes people realize they're not spiritually mature enough for this level of responsibility. We pray that he finds his place in Jehovah's organization somewhere else. But Timothy told me later that he had heard Brother Phillips crying in the bathroom the night before he left, repeating over and over, "I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend anymore." That night, lying in my narrow bed and listening to the sounds of the city beyond our window, I felt something shift inside me. Just a small movement, like a pebble rolling down a hill before an avalanche. For the first time since arriving, I wondered what Brother Phillips had meant by pretend. The transformation happened so gradually that I almost didn't notice it. Like a slow-cooking poison, the environment at Bethel began to change the very core of who I was. By my 2nd month, I found myself automatically lowering my voice in conversations, constantly checking over my shoulder before speaking, and measuring every word before it left my mouth. Brother Timothy had developed a nervous tic, a slight twitching of his left eye that became more pronounced during morning worship. "I got called into Brother Reed's office yesterday," he whispered to me one evening as we prepared for bed. "Someone reported that I was seen talking to Sister Foster in the hallway for more than 5 minutes. They wanted to know what we discussed." "What? Did you tell them?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "The truth. We were talking about the new shipping procedures. But Brother Reed said that extended conversations between single brothers and sisters could lead to improper thoughts. Even if the topics were theocratic, he said I needed to be more careful about maintaining proper boundaries." I watched Timothy's hands shake as he folded his pajamas with mechanical precision. Something cold settled in my stomach. "Did he say who reported it?" "No. But he said the organization has eyes everywhere because Jehovah sees everything, and faithful brothers and sisters help him watch over the spiritual cleanliness of his house." That phrase haunted me. Eyes everywhere. I began to notice things I had missed before, how conversations would shift when certain people entered the room, how Brother Martinez would sometimes appear unexpectedly in our work area, standing quietly, in corners and observing how Sister Foster would take notes during casual conversations in the break room. The male situation became clearer during my 3rd month. Brother Alan, who had seemed increasingly withdrawn, shared something during a rare moment when we were alone in the shipping area. "My mother wrote asking why my letters home seemed different," he said, his voice barely audible above the machinery. "She said, I used to write about specific people and experiences, but now my letters only talk about the wonderful spiritual routine and the privilege of serving. The thing is, David, I don't remember writing those phrases." He showed me a copy of a letter he had written to his parents, or thought he had written. The handwriting was his, but the language was strange, formal, filled with organizational terminology that didn't sound like Alan at all. "I think they're reading our letters before they go out," he whispered. "And maybe they're suggesting changes to make them more appropriate." That evening, I paid closer attention to my own letter to my parents. As I wrote about my experiences, I found myself automatically avoiding certain topics, unconsciously, using the approved language I heard every day. When I tried to write about my growing concerns, my hand would literally stop moving. It was as if there was a filter between my thoughts and the paper, allowing only sanitized observations to pass through. The dining room became a stage where we all performed spiritual contentment. 300 people eating in synchronized silence, every movement calculated, every expression carefully neutral. Brother Reed would walk among the tables during meals, his presence causing subtle shifts in posture and breathing patterns. I began to understand that we weren't being fed, we were being observed. "Brother Morrison," Sister Foster approached me during a coffee break in November, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant this wasn't a casual conversation. "I've noticed you've been spending considerable time studying publications that aren't part of our current Bethel study schedule. The Insight volumes, some of the older Watchtower-bound volumes. May I ask what prompted this additional research?" I felt my throat go dry. "I've always enjoyed deep Bible study, Sister Foster. I thought expanding my understanding would make me more effective in my service here." Her smile was practiced, professional. "That's commendable, Brother Morrison. However, the Bethel elders have found that when brothers venture too far into independent research, it can sometimes lead to confusion or even doubt about present truth. We have an approved study schedule for a reason. Perhaps you could channel that enthusiasm into more focused preparation for our weekly studies." "Of course," I heard myself say, though inside I felt something shrinking. "I appreciate the guidance." But that night, I couldn't stop thinking about her phrase, independent research. Since when was reading the organization's own publications considered independent? Since when was studying the Bible with their own reference materials somehow dangerous? I began to test small boundaries. During the Bethel family Watchtower study, I raised my hand to comment on a paragraph about Jesus' teaching methods. The article mentions that Jesus often used questions to help people think more deeply about spiritual matters, I said. I was wondering if we might discuss some of the questions he asked and why they were effective. The study conductor, Brother Harrison, paused for a moment longer than seemed natural. "That's an interesting observation, Brother Morrison. However, tonight's study is focused on applying the spiritual principles discussed in the article to our personal lives and service. Perhaps we could discuss your question after the meeting." He never approached me after the meeting. The incident that changed everything happened during my 4th month. Brother Timothy had been called into increasingly frequent meetings with Brother Reed, each one leaving him more withdrawn and anxious. His eye twitch had become constant, and he had started talking in his sleep, fragments of conversations that sounded like confessions or apologies. One December morning, Timothy's bed was empty. His belongings were gone, just like Brother Philip's, before him. But this time I had heard something during the night. Around 2 a.m., I had awakened to the sound of Timothy crying quietly into his pillow. When I whispered his name, he turned to me with tears streaming down his face. "David," he had said, his voice broken. "They want me to write a letter to the brothers back home. They want me to confess to having doubts about the organization. They say it's for my own spiritual good, but I don't have doubts about God. I just have questions about some of the things I've seen here." "What kind of questions?" I had asked. "Why are we not allowed to have friendships? Why does everything we say get reported? Why do they read our mail? Why can't we just serve God without all this watching?" He had paused, wiping his eyes with shaking hands. Brother Reed said that questioning the organization's methods is the same as questioning Jehovah. He said that if I can't accept theocratic order without reservation, then maybe I'm not spiritually qualified for Bethel service. I had tried to comfort him, but my words felt hollow even to me. How could I reassure him when I was beginning to have the same questions? Now he was gone, and I was alone with a new roommate, Brother Kevin Walsh, Timothy's cousin from Minnesota, who arrived that very afternoon with suspicious timing. Kevin was friendly, talkative, and asked a lot of questions about my background, my family, my spiritual goals. Something about his eagerness to know everything about me felt wrong. That evening, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my life. Instead of attending the scheduled book study, I told Brother Kevin I was feeling unwell and needed to rest. Once the building grew quiet, I slipped out of my room and made my way to the library. The Bethel Library was normally locked after evening activities, but I had noticed that the cleaning crew left it open while they worked in the adjacent offices. I wanted to do something I had never done before. Read without guidance, study without predetermined conclusions, think without the filter of organizational just a Bible. No Watchtower publications, no study aids, no organizational commentary. I opened to Matthew 23, where Jesus speaks to the religious leaders of his time. As I read his words about those who tie up heavy loads and put them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them, something inside me cracked open. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted in the marketplaces and to have men call them Rabbi. The words seemed to leap off the page. I thought about the rigid hierarchy at Bethel, the way certain individuals were treated with extraordinary deference, the way questioning was discouraged and submission was valued above understanding. I read until my eyes burned and my hands cramped from holding the book. For the first time in months, I felt like I was actually studying rather than simply absorbing pre-digested information. For the first time since arriving at Bethel, I felt close to God, not to an organization, but to the actual divine presence I had sought my entire life. When I finally returned to my room, Brother Kevin was waiting up for me. "Feeling better?" he asked, but there was something calculating in his voice. "Brother Reed was looking for you earlier. I told him you were resting." "Thank you," I said. But as I lay down to sleep, I realized that my absence had been noted, reported, and would likely be addressed in the morning. I was right. At 7 a.m. before breakfast, Brother Reed knocked on our door. "Brother Morrison, please come with me." As I followed him down the corridor, I felt like I was walking toward a cliff. Behind us, I could hear Brother Kevin following at a distance, and I understood with perfect clarity that nothing I said in the coming conversation would remain private. The avalanche had begun. Brother Reed's office was smaller than I'd expected, but every inch of it spoke of authority. The walls were lined with bound volumes of Watchtower publications dating back decades, and behind his desk hung a framed photograph of the current governing body. The morning light coming through his single window cast long shadows across the room, making everything feel stark and unforgiving. "Please sit down, Brother Morrison," he said, gesturing to a straight-backed chair positioned directly in front of his desk. There was no warmth in his voice, no pretense of brotherly concern. This was business. I sat down, my hands automatically folding in my lap in a gesture of submission I had learned without realizing it. Brother Reed remained standing for a moment, studying me with those calculating eyes I had come to know so well. Then he walked around his desk and sat down, placing a manila folder directly in front of him. "David," he said, and the use of my first name without the title brother sent a chill through me. "We need to discuss your spiritual condition." He opened the folder, and I caught a glimpse of papers. Reports, I realized with growing horror. Reports about me, written observations, documented conversations. How long had they been watching? How detailed were their records? "Over the past several weeks," Brother Reed continued, his voice measured and clinical, "multiple brothers and sisters have expressed concerns about your spiritual attitude. Brother Kevin mentioned that you were absent from last night's book study, claiming illness, but the cleaning staff reported seeing you in the library reading unauthorized materials." My mouth went dry. "I was reading the Bible," I managed to say, "without organizational aids, without proper guidance." His tone remained neutral, but there was steel underneath. "Brother Morrison..." "David, do you understand the spiritual danger? In independent Bible study, the Ethiopian eunuch needed Philip to guide him. Even he couldn't understand Scripture without help from someone who understood God's organization. I felt something rising in my chest, a combination of fear and anger that I had never experienced before. But Philip wasn't an organization. He was just a man filled with God's Spirit, helping another person understand. "Stop!" The word cut through the air like a blade. Brother Reed leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. This kind of reasoning, this questioning of theocratic order, this is what leads to spiritual shipwreck." He pulled out a sheet of paper from the folder. "Sister Foster reported that you've been asking questions during breaks about topics not covered in our current study schedule. Brother Martinez noted that your work attitude has become less enthusiastic over the past month. Brother Kevin has expressed concern about comments you've made about the organization's methods of spiritual oversight." Each accusation felt like a physical blow. I realized that every conversation, every moment of doubt, every question I had, thought was private, had been carefully documented and reported. "I haven't said anything against the organization," I said, hearing the desperation in my own voice. "You don't have to speak against it directly," Brother Reed replied. "Your attitude speaks volumes. Your questioning spirit is evident to those who are spiritually mature enough to recognize it. The fact that you were in the library last night, reading the Bible without organizational guidance, shows that you're developing an independent spirit that is incompatible with theocratic submission." He leaned back in his chair, studying me with the expression of a doctor examining a particularly interesting specimen. "Let me be very clear about something, David. This organization is God's visible representative on earth. When you question our methods, you're questioning Jehovah himself. When you resist our guidance, you're resisting divine direction. When you seek understanding outside of our publications, you're opening yourself up to Satan's influence." The room felt like it was shrinking around me. "But I love God," I said, the words coming out as barely more than a whisper. "I came here because I wanted to serve him." Love for God is demonstrated through obedience to his organization. "Brother," Reed said, his voice taking on the cadence of a prepared speech, "if you truly loved Jehovah, you would accept our guidance without question. You would trust that the governing body knows better than you do about spiritual matters. You would submit yourself completely to theocratic order." Something inside me broke open at those words, not broke apart, but broke free. For the first time since arriving at Bethel, I saw the situation with perfect clarity. This wasn't about God. This wasn't about faith. This was about control, pure and simple. "What if I have questions?" I asked, my voice stronger now. What if I see things that don't seem right? What if I want to understand why certain policies exist? Brother Reed's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Then you write a letter requesting to leave Bethel service, because this level of spiritual responsibility is clearly too much for you to handle. The silence that followed was deafening. Outside the window, I could hear the sounds of Brooklyn waking up, cars honking, people talking, life happening normally, while my world was falling apart. I thought about my parents, about how proud they were that their son was serving at the center of God's earthly organization. I thought about the friends back home who looked up to me as an example of spiritual maturity. I thought about the future I had planned, the life of service I had imagined. Then I thought about Timothy's tears in the darkness. I thought about Brother Philip's disappearing without explanation. I thought about the fear in everyone's eyes, the way conversations stopped when certain people entered rooms, the way we all performed spiritual contentment while our souls withered inside. And if I don't write that letter, I asked. Brother Reed smiled then, and it was the most chilling expression I had ever seen. Then we write it for you, and we make sure that everyone you know, your parents, your congregation, your friends, understands exactly why you were removed from Bethel service. We make sure they know about your questioning spirit, your resistance to theocratic order, your independent attitude that made you unsuitable for spiritual responsibility. The threat was crystal clear. Submit or be destroyed, conform or be branded as spiritually defective. Accept the cage or have your reputation, your relationships, your entire life within the organization systematically dismantled. I looked at Brother Reed, sitting behind his desk with his neat folder of reports and his wall of publications and his photograph of the men who claimed to speak for God. I looked at the cage they had built with walls of doctrine and bars of surveillance and locks of spiritual intimidation. And for the first time in my life, I chose freedom over safety. "I'll write the letter," I said quietly. Brother Reed nodded with satisfaction. "I'm glad you're making the mature decision, David. You'll have it on my desk by tomorrow morning, and you'll be leaving Bethel by the end of the week." As I stood, "To leave," he called after me. "Oh, when David, I hope you understand that discussing this conversation with anyone would be extremely unwise. The brothers here have enough spiritual concerns to worry about without being troubled by your personal struggles." I walked out of that office knowing that my life would never be the same. But for the first time since arriving at Bethel, I also knew that I was walking toward truth, even if that truth led me away from everything I had once believed was sacred. The 3 days between that meeting and my departure felt like walking through a carefully orchestrated funeral. Kevin had been reassigned to a different room immediately after my conversation with Brother Reed, and I found myself completely alone in a space that had once housed 2 people. The silence was profound, broken only by the sounds of normal Bethel life continuing around me while I prepared to leave everything I had once considered sacred. Writing the letter was the hardest thing I had ever done, not because I didn't mean the words, but because I knew that every sentence would be scrutinized, copied, and potentially shared with my parents, my home congregation, and anyone else the organization deemed necessary to inform about my spiritual failure. Brother Reed had made it clear that the tone needed to be appropriately repentant, acknowledging my unsuitability for Bethel service and my need for spiritual readjustment. I sat at the small desk by the window, looking out at the Brooklyn Heights promenade, where normal people walked their dogs and enjoyed the autumn air, people who had no idea that just a few blocks away, someone was writing a confession of thought crimes. My hands shook as I began. "Dear brothers, I have come to realize that I am not spiritually mature enough to continue serving at Bethel. Recent self-examination has revealed that I have been developing an independent spirit that is incompatible with theocratic submission." The words felt like poison flowing from my pen, but I understood the game now. This wasn't about truth, it was about control. And sometimes, to escape control, you have to play along with the controller's rules until you're free enough to reject them entirely. Brother Martinez approached me during my final day in the shipping department with an expression I had never seen before, something that looked almost like sadness, though it was carefully masked. "Brother Morrison," he said quietly, checking to make sure no one else was within hearing distance, "I want you to know that your work here has been exemplary. Your attention to detail, your dedication, these have not gone unnoticed." I looked at him carefully, wondering if this was another test, another report being compiled. But something in his eyes suggested otherwise. "Thank you, Brother Martinez. I've learned a lot here." He nodded slowly, then did something that surprised me completely. He handed me a small piece of paper, folded tightly. "Perhaps you might find this helpful in your future spiritual journey," he said, his voice so low I could barely hear him. "Sometimes understanding requires perspective." I slipped the paper into my pocket without looking at it, understanding instinctively that this exchange should remain private. Later, alone in my room, I unfolded it to find a single Bible verse written in Brother Martinez's careful handwriting. "And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." John 8:32. Below it, in even smaller letters, he had written, "Sometimes freedom costs everything we thought we wanted, but slavery costs everything we actually are." That evening, Sister Foster approached me after the final meal I would eat in the Bethel dining room. "Brother Morrison," she said, her voice carrying none of its usual professional authority, "I wanted to wish you well in your future service." She paused, glancing around to ensure we weren't being observed. "I hope you find what you're looking for." There was something in her tone that made me look at her more carefully. For just a moment, the carefully constructed mask slipped, and I saw exhaustion in her eyes, a bone-deep weariness that spoke of years of maintaining appearances while something inside slowly died. "Sister Foster," I said quietly, "are you—" "I'm fine," she said quickly, the mask snapping back into place. "Just remember that Jehovah sees the heart, Brother Morrison, not just the outward appearance." She walked away before I could respond, but her words echoed in my mind for hours afterward. The strangest part of those final days was the way other Bethel residents treated me. It wasn't open hostility. That would have been easier to handle. Instead, it was as if I had become gradually invisible. Conversations would stop when I approached groups in the hallways. During meals, the chairs on either side of me remained empty. Even the custodial staff seemed to avoid making eye contact when they cleaned our floor. Brother Allen, who I had thought might at least acknowledge my departure, passed me in the corridor on my second-to-last day without so much as a nod. But later that evening, I found a small book wedged under my door, a collection of psalms with several passages underlined in pencil. On the inside cover, someone had written, "For when you feel alone in the wilderness." I never confirmed it. Was from Alan, but something about the careful engineer's handwriting suggested it was. The fact that he had risked even this small gesture of compassion in an environment where any association with me could be seen as suspicious spoke volumes about the courage it took to maintain humanity in such a place. On my final morning, I packed my single brown suitcase with the same clothes I had brought, plus the few personal items I had accumulated. Some letters from home, a few books that had been approved for personal study, and the small piece of paper Brother Martinez had given me, which I had memorized and then hidden in my Bible. The checkout process was clinical and efficient. Brother Reed reviewed an inventory of Bethel property to ensure I wasn't taking anything that belonged to the organization. He examined my personal books to make sure I wasn't removing any restricted materials. He even checked my pockets, explaining, that sometimes brothers inadvertently take organizational property when they're emotionally distressed. "Your bus ticket to Cleveland has been purchased," he informed me, handing me an envelope. "Your parents have been notified that you're returning home and will need spiritual readjustment. Your home congregation elders will receive a letter explaining the circumstances of your departure." I nodded, understanding that my reputation had been carefully managed in advance. Whatever that letter said, it would ensure that my homecoming would be anything but celebratory. As I walked toward the main gate with my suitcase, I turned back for one final look at the complex that had been my home for nearly 5 months. The buildings looked as imposing as ever, the walls as high, the security as tight. But now I understood what they were actually designed to contain. Not just people, but thoughts, questions, the very human tendency to seek truth beyond organizational boundaries. At the gate, the same security guard who had welcomed me checked my identification one final time. "Good luck, son," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice that suggested he understood more than his position allowed him to say. The gate closed behind me with the same metallic click I had heard on my arrival. But this time, instead of sounding like paradise opening, it sounded like freedom beginning. I stood on the sidewalk outside those imposing walls, breathing the cold December air and feeling something I hadn't experienced in months, the absence of constant observation. For the first time since arriving at Bethel, no one was watching me. No one was taking notes about my behavior. No one was analyzing my words for signs of spiritual weakness. I was alone with my thoughts, my questions, and my growing understanding that the God I sought had never been imprisoned behind those walls. The bus station was only a few blocks away, but I walked slowly, savoring each step that took me further from the organization's headquarters and closer to whatever came next. I didn't know what I would tell my parents. I didn't know how I would rebuild my faith outside the only religious structure I had ever known. I didn't know what kind of life awaited someone who had been marked as spiritually unsuitable by the organization that claimed to speak for God. But I knew that for the first time in my adult life, I was free to find out. The Greyhound bus pulled away from the Port Authority terminal on a grey December morning in 1978, carrying me back to Cleveland, and toward a future I couldn't yet imagine. As the familiar skyline of Brooklyn faded behind me, I pressed my face against the cold window and watched the world open up again. Highways and small towns, gas stations and diners, all the ordinary places where ordinary people lived there, lives without constant surveillance or spiritual oversight. My parents were waiting at the Cleveland station when I arrived 14 hours later. My father's face showed confusion more than disappointment, while my mother's eyes were red from crying. They had received Brother Reed's letter, of course, explaining that their son had demonstrated an independent spirit incompatible with theocratic service and would need spiritual readjustment before he could be considered for any privileges in the local congregation. "Son," my father said as we drove home through the familiar streets of our neighborhood, "we don't understand what happened. The letter mentioned questioning and doubts, but you were always so strong in the truth." I looked out at the houses where I had grown up, each one containing families living their private lives without organizational oversight, and I realized I didn't know how to explain what I had experienced. How do you tell people who have never been in a cage that freedom has a different smell? How do you describe surveillance to people who have never been watched? "I still believe in God, Dad," I said finally. "I just learned that there's a difference between serving God and serving an organization that claims to speak for Him." The silence that followed lasted the rest of the drive home. The elders from our local Kingdom Hall visited 3 days after my return. Men I had known since childhood sat in our living room with their Bibles and their serious expressions, ready to provide the spiritual guidance that would help me readjust my thinking and eventually return to a proper spiritual condition. David, Brother Williams began, we've received a detailed report about your time at Bethel. The brothers there are concerned that you developed a critical spirit toward theocratic arrangements. Can you help us understand what led to these doubts? I had prepared for this conversation during the long bus ride home. I had questions about some of the methods I observed, I said carefully. Things that seemed to focus more on controlling behavior than encouraging genuine faith. Brother Thompson leaned forward, his voice taking on the patient tone used with spiritual children. But David, don't you understand that organizational structure is necessary for order? Without proper supervision and guidance, people drift into independent thinking that leads them away from truth. There it was again, that phrase that had haunted me at Bethel, independent thinking. As if the ability to reason and question was a spiritual disease rather than a gift from the God who had created human minds capable of discernment. Over the following months, I attended meetings sporadically, sitting in the back rows and listening to the same talks about submission and obedience that had once filled me with zeal. But now I heard them differently. I noticed how often speakers emphasized the importance of not questioning organizational decisions. I observed how frequently the literature warned against independent Bible study. I saw how systematically critical thinking was discouraged in favor of unquestioning acceptance. The breaking point came 6 months after my return, during a circuit assembly. The circuit overseer, a man I had once revered as spiritually mature, gave a talk titled "Guard Against Independent Thinking." He spent 45 minutes explaining how questioning organizational policies was a sign of pride, how seeking understanding outside approved publications was dangerous, and how true spirituality required complete submission to human leadership. Sitting in that convention hall, surrounded by hundreds of people nodding in agreement, I finally understood that my experience at Bethel hadn't been an aberration. It was the system working exactly as designed, to create a population of believers who had learned not to believe in their own capacity for spiritual discernment. I stopped attending meetings entirely after that assembly. The elders made several attempts to encourage me, but I politely declined their visits. My parents struggled with my decision, caught between their love for their son and their fear of organizational disapproval. Eventually they chose what they believed was spiritual, safety over family loyalty, limiting our contact to brief, uncomfortable phone calls on holidays. The loneliness was profound. I had lost not just my religious community, but my entire social structure, my family relationships, and my sense of identity. For months, I felt like a man without a country, belonging neither to the organization I had left nor to the wider world I didn't yet understand how to navigate. But slowly, gradually, I began to rebuild. I found work at a small accounting firm where my attention to detail, trained by years of organizational precision, served me well. I began reading voraciously, exploring philosophy, history, and theology from perspectives I had never been allowed to consider. I discovered that there were thousands of people throughout history who had sought truth without organizational mediation, who had found God in silence and solitude rather than in institutional structures. Most importantly, I learned to trust my own spiritual instincts again. I began to understand that the God I had sought my entire life had never been confined to any human organization. I found sacred moments in ordinary experiences, watching sunrise paint the sky pink and gold, listening to rain against my apartment windows, having genuine conversations with people who accepted me without requiring conformity to predetermined beliefs. In 1983, 5 years after leaving Bethel, I met Sarah at a community center where I had started volunteering to help elderly residents with their finances. She was a social worker, a woman who had never been part of any high-control religious group, but who understood intuitively what it meant to help people rebuild their lives after trauma. We married 2 years later, and she became my partner in discovering what healthy spirituality could look like. Today, at 67, I look back on that young man who walked through the gates of Bethel with such certainty and feel both sadness and gratitude. Sadness for his naivety, for the pain that awaited him, for the relationships he would lose in pursuit of authentic faith. But gratitude for his courage to question, to seek truth, even when it led him away from everything he thought he wanted. Never returned to organized religion in the traditional sense. Instead, I found spiritual community among people who valued questions over answers, who understood that faith grows stronger when tested by honest inquiry, who believed that God is large enough to handle human doubt and flexible enough to meet people wherever they are in their spiritual journey. Sarah and I raised 2 children who learned to think critically about spiritual matters, who were encouraged to ask difficult questions, who understood that genuine faith requires the freedom to doubt. They both found their own spiritual paths, different from mine, different from each other, but authentic to their own experiences and understanding. Sometimes people ask me if I regret my time at Bethel, if I wish I had never experienced that particular form of spiritual imprisonment. The answer is complex. I regret the pain it caused my family, the relationships it cost me, the years it took to rebuild my sense of spiritual autonomy. But I don't regret the education it provided about the difference between institutional control and authentic faith. That experience taught me to recognize the warning signs of spiritual manipulation, the discouragement of questions, the demand for unquestioning obedience, the claim to exclusive truth, the punishment of dissent through shunning and social isolation. These lessons have served me well throughout my life, helping me identify and avoid other situations where authority figures sought to substitute their judgment for my own spiritual discernment. This is a real story shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you so much for trusting us with it. If you too have a story you'd like to share, please write in the comments. We would be very happy to tell your story on our channel. To anyone watching this who may be struggling with similar questions about spiritual authority, control, and authentic faith, please know that you're not alone. The courage to question, to seek truth beyond institutional boundaries, to trust your own spiritual instincts. This isn't rebellion against God. It's often the very path that leads us closer to the divine presence we've been seeking all along. Freedom isn't the absence of faith. It's the space where genuine faith can finally grow.